So we've just given a bit of a refresher about the various elements that make up the red meat integrity system. Now we're going to get into some more detail around livestock production assurance in particular and record keeping, because good records and systems are the foundation of the integrity system. Let's get stuck into record keeping. So I guess my first message is that there is no perfect formula when it comes to record keeping. In terms of how, and you would have just seen there in those great little insights, some producers find that keeping clear notes in a diary or a record book works well. Others keep records with farm management software or computer spreadsheets. But basically, regardless of the method, it's important that all the relevant management activities are accurately, clearly recorded and capture the required information, and it's what works best for you. But should you be required to participate in an LPA audit, your LPA records will be reviewed by an auditor, so it's really important to make sure that they are accurate and up to date. So that's what's of most importance, not necessarily how you're keeping those records. It is particularly important that as producers, you do get your records in order well before an audit. An audit's not a great time to do this, or should it not be the only motivation for doing this? Providing lifetime traceability and the ability to tell a good story around livestock through good record keeping can also actually be a marketing advantage for you as well. But to make your record keeping easier, ISC has created some record keeping templates which are aligned to each of the 7 LPA requirements and outline all the information that you need to be keeping a track of. Now, these are available there. You can see we've got a little integrity insight up on the screen. Now, you'll see this throughout the webinar this evening, but we've got these record keeping templates aligned to those requirements. They're available on our website. You can search for record keeping template. You can order them in hard copy as well through the LPA service centre, or you can certainly call the ISC customer service team. Now, don't worry, you don't need to scribble any of this down. We'll provide you with that post-webinar email in the next couple of days with some links to all these great insights and useful information as well. Now, you're certainly not obliged to use the templates that ISC have if you're already capturing the required information in another format or program. But maybe if you don't currently have a recording system, then they're a great resource to ensure that you are capturing what you need to. A recent change made to the LPA website now allows all LPA documentation and required records to be saved directly within a producer's LPA account. And our integrity insight for this new feature is also the option exists now to complete your property risk assessment and your farm biosecurity plan entirely digitally within the LPA service centre rather than on a printed template or uploading another electronic file. So the benefits of all your record keeping being able to be stored within your LPA account is that it means that all your records are in one location. You can retrieve them at any time, and certainly they're easy access for auditing. We also have a fact sheet for how to create or upload documents in your LPA account, and that's also available on the ISC website, and we'll share the link with you in the post-webinar email as well. So when we come to record keeping, there's probably a couple of or 2 main types of records. So what we refer to here is property management records. Now, these are often completed and reviewed, say, once a year, for example. And this would be things like the property risk assessment, the biosecurity plan, and your animal welfare certification. The other type of records we refer more to as operational records. Now, these are the types of things which are filled out daily or weekly and can include things like visitor registers for biosecurity, feed and livestock treatment records, commodity vendor decks, NVDs and livestock movements. Now, as mentioned previously, when there are opportunities to utilise your current record keeping systems for the purposes of LPA, then that's totally acceptable, as long as all the required information is captured. So please don't feel that you need to create duplicate records using the LPA template if you have a current system that's already being used. And certainly if you adopt an LPA template, for example, there's an opportunity to add to that template in order to capture other information that might be of use to your business. So things like costs and that might help you with budget, for example, in particular types of records, or if you're keeping records for your as part of your farm chemical user accreditation, then it may also meet the requirements as part of your LPA program as well. So what I'll do now for the remainder of the session really is to go through each of those 7 LPA requirement areas and provide examples of how you might like to go about keeping records for each of those. So the first requirement that we're going to take a look at is around the property risk assessment. So for this requirement, you must be able to identify any possible risk on your property where livestock could come into contact with physical and or chemical contaminants, and develop strategies for how this risk will be controlled. So to meet this requirement, you need to complete a risk assessment and a map. You need to update the risk assessment when changes occur on farm. You need to document and file the risk assessment and map for auditing. And just to note that this can now be completed completely digitally within your LPA account. Now, some examples to meet the record keeping requirements part of this requirement. Here's an example risk assessment map from the ISC record keeping templates. Now, as I said, the risk assessment must be carried out when any changes to the enterprise current activities occur, such as a change in land use on the property, for example. It's also required that you mark on the property map any suspect areas, such as old yards and dip sites, treated yards, old rubbish dump sites, treated power poles and the like. And you can see from the map here where those risk areas have been marked as examples on the screen. So things like a mining dam, sheep yards, cattle yards, there was obviously an old rubbish dump, land used next door by recreational shooters and the like. So you're just marking out what could be a potential risk and marking that up on a map. Here's another example from the ISC record keeping template where risks have been documented and a description provided of how the site is being managed to eliminate the risk of contamination. So the types of information that you'd be capturing here is just listing what the possible risk or the risk site is and then referring to that on the property map, the reason that the risk has been identified, any results that you might have or further analysis that you might have had done on that particular risk, and then a brief description of how the site is being managed to eliminate the potential for contamination of livestock. The first one there is around a rubbish dump. The reason or the risk there as part of that dump would be old chemical drums and batteries. There's obviously been a soil sample taken that's identified dieldrin and BHC levels, and then the short description of how the site's being managed is that the rubbish dump was fenced out in 2005. So the next LPA requirement that we'll take a look at is biosecurity. Now, for this requirement, you must implement on-farm biosecurity systems to minimise the risk of infectious disease being introduced to livestock production properties and the subsequent spread of any such diseases. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to keep a formal documented farm biosecurity plan. Now, this, similar to the farm risk assessment, can be completed digitally within your LPA account. You need to source a livestock health declaration or equivalent for introduced livestock. You should have systems in place to notify unusual disease, illness or mortalities. And you need to be able to keep records of movements of people, vehicles and equipment entering your property where it is reasonable and practical. Now, just a couple of notes around the biosecurity plan. Some producers, some of you may have completed a JBAS farm biosecurity plan. This will meet the LPA requirements. And similarly, if you've used another program or another template to create a biosecurity plan, and there are plenty of them out there, you just need to check that it covers all the required information that the LPA template has to ensure that you're compliant with the biosecurity requirements of LPA, but that it's absolutely fine to use another template to create your biosecurity plan. So here's an example from the ISC record keeping templates. But basically a formal documented farm biosecurity plan must address the following, and that's to manage and record the introduction of movement of livestock in a way that minimises the risk of introducing or spreading infectious disease. As I said earlier, where practical and reasonable, control people, equipment and vehicles entering the property, therefore minimising the potential for property contamination. And if possible, keep a record of those movements and prevent and control animal diseases on farm by regularly monitoring and managing your livestock. Now, the key with biosecurity is to focus on what is relevant to your farm and your production system, and any specific requirements that relate to your state and territory. So a number of states now have their own separate biosecurity legislation, but making sure that you're managing your state and your LPA biosecurity can be done within the one document. You've just got to check that you've meeting those requirements. With the biosecurity template and a plan, it doesn't mean that you tick every box or you address every issue that's potentially raised, because a lot of some of those things may not be applicable to your situation. The important thing to consider, though, with biosecurity is that what risks apply to your farm and to your business, and how you're going to manage those risks. So just a very practical example for me, I'm about an hour from Canberra. I'm in an area that's becoming an increasingly peri-urban, so small landholders around me. I have 7 neighbours. We produce superfine merinos. Neighbours around me are all crossbreds or alpacas, goats, things like that. And we also have a river that runs through our property that, of course, I would mark up on a risk assessment map. So our biggest issues are weed incursions travelling along the river, and also we worry quite a bit about lice from neighbouring properties. So our biggest issue is regular weed control when neighbours might not do that, and then also having some fairly good boundary fencing and monitoring programs to make sure that we don't have straying stock. That risk is our biggest risk. That may not necessarily be the same for everybody, the same as other risks that would present in a more extensive grazing situation, for example, may not be relevant for me. So the key is that biosecurity, it's certainly not a one size fits all. It's the understanding the risks on your farm and how you're going to manage them. And biosecurity is something that producers have always managed. What the biosecurity plan does, and through the LPA requirement, is simply ask that we are now able to document that we understand what that biosecurity risk is and how we're going to manage that going forward. Within the ISC record keeping templates, you can also see some examples there of a property visitor register template. So just some ideas on how you can capture details of when people come and visit the property. The next LPA requirement that we'll take a look at is animal welfare. So animal welfare is a really important requirement for LPA, and it was introduced in October 2017. How to meet this requirement: you need to have a copy of the animal welfare standards and guidelines accessible as a reference. The person responsible for the property and that has the LPA accreditation needs to have received training in the standards and guidelines, and that can be done through the LPA learning module, and that staff involved in livestock husbandry on a property or on a pick are familiar with the contents of the standards and guidelines and have been trained in a manner consistent with those guidelines. The integrity insight there is to download the standards and guidelines and save it to your computer as a favourite, so that all your team members can access it. And we'll share the link with that with you in the post-webinar email. The record keeping component to the animal welfare requirement is to, as I said, you need to have done the animal welfare learning and assessment and receive a certificate, and that is how you meet the record keeping requirements for that element of LPA. The next requirement that we'll take a look at is the safe and responsible animal treatments. So for this requirement, you must undertake steps to ensure that animal treatments are administered in a safe and responsible manner, and the one that minimises the risk of chemical residues and physical hazards. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to document and file all animal treatment details. You need to complete a chemical user course. You need to make a note of when equipment used for livestock treatment is cleaned. You need to record authorisation and directions for any off-label use of chemicals that might have occurred. You need to make a note of animals exposed to physical contaminants, such as broken needles. And you also need to mark animals treated with HGPs with a triangular ear mark. Now, the integrity insight there is just a reminder for WA producers: if bringing stock onto your property, you need to check the HGP declaration. You cannot declare stock are HGP free unless you have proof that they are. Now, here is an example from the record keeping templates. of a livestock treatment record. So the types of information that you would be capturing on these documents would be the treatment date, the description, location and number of livestock treated, the product trade name, batch number, the dose rate or the dipping and jetting rate, and the approximate live weight of the animals, the withholding period and export slaughter interval, the date safe for slaughter, and who it was treated by. Now, a couple of things here before we move on. The integrity insight is you can actually ask your supplier or your rural retailer to add the vet product batch number and expiry date and the withholding period and export slaughter interval period to the invoice for your treatment records. If you don't know what the withholding period and the export slaughter interval is, you can go to the APVMA website. Quite often they are actually different, and we'll share with you the link to the APVMA website, so don't worry about that. But in terms of the record keeping template up here, it's really useful, and I would recommend that you do start to incorporate the date safe for slaughter. So rather than be shedding sheep and getting ready to load, for example, and then trying to quickly go and double check a batch of chemical and making sure where it is within a withholding period or an export slaughter interval as you're trying to complete an NVD, when you're doing the actual treatment, go through and set a note in your calendar, and you can even have it come up as a reminder on your phone, but just making sure that you've worked out your withholding period and your ESI from the date of treatment, and then you'll get you'll know what that safe date for slaughter is and if they can be processed from there. Capturing details by such as who treated the animals is really useful, particularly if you need to go back and double check something, of course, but if there was to be a work health and safety incident on the farm, you would have a record there as well. So this is just an example where it's not just record keeping for LPA, it's record keeping for good business as well. And you can make your records work for your business. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of issues moving my slide. The next example here is a chemical inventory record. So the information that you'd be capturing here would be the date received, the product name or the quantity, the expiry date or the date of manufacture, the batch number, and who that chemical inventory was updated by. So again, who added it to your chemical store. Again, you can ask your supplier to add the product batch number and other details to the invoice so that you've got them for your treatment records. So when you get back to the office and you're updating your records, you've got it there on your invoice. You're not running down to the shed and thinking, oh, where did I keep that drum? So you've got it with you. It's also really useful, just another really practical tip. This is a favorite of mine. Use your phone. We've all got smartphones now with cameras on them. All your photos are date stamped. That's really handy when it comes to actually when you're treating animals. So if you've got a mob of sheep in the yards, pop your drench drum on the fence post or on the tank stand there, turn it around so you've got the batch and the all the product details. And you'll have the mob of sheep in the background. You can even have their colour ear tags, for example, know what mob it was. And then you've got a date stamp photo, and it just makes your record keeping a lot more straightforward when you get back to the office. The next requirement that we'll take a look at is the stock foods, fodder crops, grain and pasture treatments. For this requirement, you need to guarantee that animals are not exposed to foods containing chemical contamination, or have they been fed animal products. You can meet this requirement by keeping records of all ag chem treatments. Excuse me. You need to document any introduced stock feed, have management systems in place to identify livestock that may have become contaminated, map or list the treated or contaminated sites, and you should source and file all commodity vendor decks that accompany any introduced stock feed. Here on the screen, we have an example of a crop, pasture and paddock treatment record. So again, the types of information that you should be able to keep here is the date of application, the paddock identification and the location. You can refer to that as a position on the map. The crop treated, the area treated, who it was treated by, whether that was an employee or a contractor, the treatment application rate and the method, wind direction and speed, and then details about the tank mix. So the product name, chemical rate, the batch number, any withholding period details, and then again, similar to your animal treatments, the date that it was safe to harvest or graze that particular paddock or commodity, and then any notes as well. Here on the slide now, we've got an example of a grain and fodder treatment record, so quite similar. So details around the date, the location, what it was treated with, how much was treated, the application rate and method and who it was treated by, and then the details of the chemicals used. And again, this is a good example of information that you're capturing that for LPA, but you would also be required to capture for your farm chemical user course, and information that you're capturing here useful for work health and safety, but you can start to incorporate other information such as the cost of the chemical, the cost of your contractors, and then you can use that later on to refer to if you're for budgeting purposes or gross margins and cost of production. Another example here is your introduced stock feed record. So similar information, the date, what it was, the amount, where it came from, if you received a commodity vendor deck or an equivalent reference number. So that might be an invoice number, for example, whether or not there was any residue analysis from any product testing, where it was stored on farm, and then the signature of who gave the record. Now, this is quite useful for things like managing biosecurity risks around weeds, incursions. If you're able to go back and find an information about the particular product, where it was located on farm, you might be able to identify when you do have problems popping up from time to time. Here on the screen, we've got an example of a livestock feeding record. So similar information again, the description, where it was stored, who it was fed to, the mobs, when the feeding period from start to finish, and who was responsible for the activity. This would be really useful to also start to add in costs and things like that, particularly if it was in a drought situation. And it might also be something that you could start to incorporate some of your animal information as well. So if you're keeping a track of weights, condition scores, for example, or if it was a confinement feeding situation in a drought, would also be very useful as well. So again, one set of records across your business. As long as you're keeping the requirements to meet the LPA part, you can also add as much information as you like as well. The example here on the screen is around the commodity vendor deck. So all introduced stock feed should be accompanied by a commodity vendor declaration to guarantee that the feed purchased is safe from chemical contamination. Now, a commodity vendor deck needs to provide details of the chemical that was used to treat the commodity, the rate and date of the chemical application, and any relevant withholding period information from the chemical label. Now, if you can't get or you don't get a commodity vendor deck, then you need to assess the risk and keep a record of that. Alternatively, you can have a sample tested for residues. Now, when it does come to completing the national vendor deck, if you don't have a commodity vendor deck, but you suspect that the product may have been treated, then you can just apply a default 60-day withholding period to that. Now, we'll provide you with a link to commodity vendor deck information in the post-webinar email. And just to be clear that commodity vendor decks aren't required for commercially developed products such as pellets, but they are for grain and hay. The next requirement that we'll take a look at is the preparation for dispatch of livestock. Now, for this one, you need to guarantee that livestock are fit to transport and ensure that they experience minimal stress and contamination during assembly and transport. How to meet that requirement: you need to ensure the livestock are fit to load. You need to record the transport details, including vehicle registration and key times. And you need to document and file all your national vendor decks. You need to record any reports of animals which may have been exposed to physical contaminants. The best integrity insight for this one is to keep a copy handy of the "Is the Animal Fit to Load" guide. It's got some really great pictures in there of what is and what isn't fit to load, particularly around injuries and illness, disease, cancer and things like that, and also really useful when it comes to helping with condition scoring, particularly light stock in drought conditions. Here on the screen is just a record for capturing details around your livestock dispatch. So information here would be the date, the number of livestock, the description, so the breed, sex and age, the date and time of yarding, the date and time of dispatch, and any comments there. So again, this is something that would be captured typically in a national vendor deck, but also useful to have that as a consolidated record, particularly if it came to an auditing purpose. In terms of the next requirement for LPA, which is livestock transactions and movements, you must guarantee that animals sold are not exposed to food safety hazards and that they meet all traceability requirements should a safety issue occur. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to record all purchases and sales. You need to keep copies of all LPA national vendor decks. You also need to record the vendor's name, the address and the PIC, record the livestock details and description, keep records of all animals purchased while still within a withholding period or an export slaughter interval, and document animals that may have been exposed to any physical contaminants. Now, for WA, a reminder that you are required to keep all your movement documents for 7 years, regardless of whether it is a plain waybill or an NVD waybill, and that goes for the consigner, transporter and receiver of the stock. Now, if you ensure that your incoming waybills are complete and correct, then you will have all the required records for an audit. Now, the biggest tip to stand by what you sell is to fill in every LPA national vendor deck correctly. The aim is to make sure that every NVD is filled out so that it is clear, complete and correct. Now, the questions in Part A of the National Vendor Deck are often where producers need a bit of a hand. Now, it's these questions that are about the animal's history. Now, this information is crucial for food safety and market access. So the key here is to stay on the safe side. And if in doubt, tick yes, and to check your records to be sure. Now, that's for questions 1 through to 8. Now, that's apart from the question about livestock ownership. Now, if you bred the livestock, you need to tick yes. If you purchased one or more animals within the consignment, then you need to tick no and indicate the most recent date of purchase. Now, a couple of other things to note about the NVD. Sometimes the consignee and the destination may be different and have different property identification codes or PICs, and it's really important that you identify this on the National Vendor Deck. In the consigned to section, you must record the full name and address of the person and or the company that the livestock are being consigned to. And in some instances, the address given in the consigned to section is different to the actual physical location that the livestock are actually being sent to. So, for example, when you're transporting livestock to be sold at a sale yard, then the consignee would typically be your agent and the destination would be the sale yard location. Now, keep an eye on accidental exposure to restricted animal matter, such as pet sheep or goats accessing dog food or pigs accessing chook scraps, and that's particularly important when it does come to filling in your National Vendor Deck. Now, we do have lots of tips on filling in the NVD, including a great animation, so that it is clear, complete and correct, and we'll share those with you in the post-webinar email. Now, the final step for Part A of the National Vendor Deck is the declaration, and just remembering that it is actually a legal declaration. Now, when you tick a box on your NVD and you sign the NVD, you are guaranteeing that your on-farm practices meet the LPA requirements and therefore ultimately our customer expectations. So your tick and anything that you put on the NVD must be backed up by accurate farm records. Now, for those of you that are LPA accredited, you've also got access to the faster, easier ENVD system. It's more accurate than paper forms and it ensures that the latest version of the NVD is being used. The ENVD reduces time and duplication spent completing livestock assurance and health decks. It reduces the cost of storing and retrieving historical consignments for auditing purposes, for example, and other admin jobs, and you don't need to wait for your new NVD books to arrive. And the other thing is that other stakeholders in the supply chain can also log in and view consignments, and that includes receivers. So, for example, if I receive a consignment of sheep here on this property and the vendor has used the ENVD, I can log in and see that ENVD on my system as well. So the ENVD is not just a National Vendor Deck, it's a system for completing all your consignment paperwork digitally, and that includes livestock assurance and health decks, your MSA decks as well. You can access the ENVD system by logging in and using your LPA login details and start creating your consignments. Now, the integrity insight there, particularly for WA, if you need a destination pick, of course, that's now mandatory in WA with national vendor decks. You've got the phone number there on the screen, or you can use the pick query search website, and we'll share those details with you on the post-webinar email. The other important thing to meet that LPA requirement around livestock transactions and movements is that you need to record all livestock movements onto your pick on the NLIS database, and you need to do that to remain LPA accredited. If a producer is selected to participate in an audit, the auditor will review whether the transfers for livestock moved onto the pick have been recorded on the database. The integrity insight there is that state legislation also requires that the buyer or receiver of the livestock completes the transfer on the NLIS database, and penalties may actually be imposed by the state and territory government for failing to complete those transfers as required. And as I said before, recording those livestock movements through the NLIS can also be a bit of a marketing advantage as well, by ensuring that animals maintain that lifetime traceability, and that's becoming increasingly important for certain markets and certain supply chains as well. Just an example here, this is just a summary of livestock purchases and movements record. So the information, if all the information listed in the livestock movement templates is being captured through your NVDs and your own paddock records, then you're not required to complete these templates. However, what you need to demonstrate is that you've got a system in place that allows you to identify which stock have been where on your property and may have been exposed to chemical residues if that was to occur. And you'll just basically need to be able to demonstrate how your records are achieving this. But this is just an example of how you can keep all those records in one place. This one on the screen here is for livestock sales and movements. So this is for animals moving off the property. So the information here would be the date, the NVD serial number, the number of stock, paddock of origin, the breed, the sex, and the destination of where they went. So just before we finish up, just did want to touch on audits, and we will have a webinar specifically around audits in a couple of, probably in a couple of months' time, I think. But certainly with an audit, the key message really is to not panic, and that audits are all about identifying areas for practical on-farm improvement. And it's really important for us, as I said right at the start, that the LPA program is an audited program. So each year we conduct these audits, about 3,000 a year, to make sure that we're able to assure our customers that we do have a rigorous program in place that underpins our market access. As part of an audit, your LPA records would be reviewed by an auditor, so it's important to make sure that they're accurate and up to date. All LPA accredited producers may be audited, and subjects for auditing are selected at random from the database of all LPA accredited producers, and this can include producers with just a few livestock. Now you can review on-farm practices against the audit checklist, or if you had those record keeping templates as well, and that will identify any areas that may need attention before an audit. So the integrity insight there is we've got a great checklist. You'll get a copy of the audit checklist within your notification pack if you are approached for an audit, or you can download it from the website in advance, and just to make sure that you've got everything in order beforehand. So what actually happens if issues are identified during an audit? There's a couple of things that can happen. If the issue is minor, the auditor may record what's known as an observation, which means that the producer just needs or should consider taking action to improve the relevant practice that's been raised as an issue. These might be things like such as not obtaining a commodity vendor deck for purchase fodder, or not correctly completing an NVD where the destination and the consignee have different addresses and that this wasn't completed correctly on the NVD. If an issue is more significant, then an auditor may raise what's known as a corrective action request, and that means that the producer actually needs to take some action to ensure compliance with that LPA requirement and submit this evidence in order to close out the car. Or the corrective action. Now, a common corrective action is where there is no biosecurity plan in place, or discrepancies between NVDs and NLIS transfers, which could then put at risk lifetime traceability. So corrective actions can be managed by uploading the required evidence to your LPA account, and this is a recent development within the LPA Service Centre, and the integrity insight there refers to the how-to guide, which is all about a fact sheet in terms of how to respond to a LPA corrective action and how to upload that information to the LPA Service Centre directly, and we'll share that information in the post-webinar email. But that's just a little bit about audits and corrective actions. But as I said, we'll have a whole webinar on audits as part of the series later down the track. Just before I do finish up, conscious that we are getting close to the end of tonight's session, where can you go for more information? Well, ISC over the last couple of years has put a lot of time into developing a suite of resources to help you meet your integrity requirements. The ISC website listed there on the screen is a great place to start. We've got the templates that I mentioned tonight, but certainly there's a series of fact sheets and checklists that go with each of the different requirements as part of Livestock Production Assurance Program, plus a whole heap of other resources across the system. The LPA Service Centre itself has some resources where you can also go and upload information directly to your account. We've also got Integrity Matters, which goes out to all LPA accredited producers over email and other stakeholders once a month. If you don't receive Integrity Matters, then you can subscribe through the website or drop us an email, and we'll share that information after tonight's webinar. We're across the usual social and digital channels, Facebook and Twitter, if you'd like to keep up to date with what we're doing there. And we have some great resources, animations, videos on our YouTube channel as well. Just before I finish, just a bit of a disclaimer, particularly as it relates to the National Vendor Deck, that it is a declaration and it is your declaration. We can't do it for you. The State Department can't do it for you. Your state farming organisation, neither can your livestock agent. But all of us certainly are here to help. And there's a whole heap of resources out there that will help you complete your national vendor decks, meet your other requirements such as your record keeping, your NLIS transfers and the like. Importantly, all of that ties together and makes up the integrity system, which means that you can stand by what you sell, which is really important to make sure that our customers remain assured of the red meat product that we produce here in Australia.